drain. Plugging your ears, let the knowledge flow.
Welcome to A Nerd's Point of View. My name is Nolie MacDonald, your host, and I have a very special guest today, Dr. Andersen, and we're going to be talking about the convergence of several fields that are really coming together in a unique and interesting way. I met Dr. Andersen, gosh, I think it's been about 2 years ago now, and while I was getting my tech startup off the ground, I was very interested in how mental health can be impacted by some of these newer technologies that are coming out, specifically with artificial intelligence and utilizing virtual reality as a conduit to reach people. Dr. Andersen, welcome to the show. And I was hoping that we could kick this off and you can give us a little bit about your background and the types of projects that you've been involved in as of late.
Thank you. I appreciate that. It's great to be here, Nolie. I can't believe it's been 2 years. It goes by pretty quickly, I guess. Yeah, I'm very happy to be here with you. And I'd love to give you a little bit of background about me. My kind of how I got here is a very interesting story. And I would say there's probably no one thing that got me here. But there are definitely some milestones that were pretty big along the way. I guess let me first kind of start off and just describe myself personally, a couple of my attributes. I'm a very curious person, and because of that, I gravitated towards science and other things, in my training. I'm also I'm very creative-minded. I love art, I love music, and things like that. But more importantly, I really like to, I guess, look for other solutions to things that improve, life, improve people's lives. I like to, if somebody says, here's a boundary, we can't do this, and it's causing problems, I like to look for reasons specifically to find a way around those boundaries. And so I like to really use creativity as an important piece, not just, I think it's important as a professional and also in our individual lives. It's one of the ways we can be healthy. It turns out. But then another thing, and I'd say that creativity actually is part of what brought me to look beyond the current profession, which doesn't really up to now embrace a ton of technology. We do have some things like transcranial magnetic stimulation and some other technology, but for the most part, psychiatry is it's kind of the same as it used to be back in the days, when we were, driving a carriage by horse and things like that. We talk to people, we listen to their symptoms, and then we kind of make guesses about how we're going to alter their brain chemistry through the drugs we use. So I wanted to bring that more modern. I think there's so much amazing technology, there's so many amazing advancements, and so much variety now that we can include things like virtual reality in our treatment once we understand the brain. And I guess the last thing I would say that really kind of brings me to this place is I really care about people in a very genuine way. And so some of the things that probably motivated me the most, every psychiatrist in their career comes to a point where they realize that we are not perfect. So don't tell anyone, right? It's a big secret. I'm pretty sure most of our patients know that before we did. But it's true, we have so much to improve. The former president of the National Institute of Mental Health, for instance, Dr. Thomas Insel, has repeatedly talked about things like the need to include more genetics, or the need to not just use the same drugs, which are not always effective, especially when you look over time. And then I guess I would say the last thing is that a lot of people don't like side effects and other things. He talks about the system as one part of it, and then even more recently, even that's not enough, even if we get everyone on an electronic record. So there's all these imperfections, and I saw this personally. I was in inpatient units, and I had actually many experiences like this, but where I would hear patients and the recovery wasn't as good as I wanted, or sometimes I even removed a bunch of medications and their lives got better, which was like, whoa, how were we doing this for 10 years? But there was one experience I really remember. I was late at night. I think it was about 2 a.m. at one of the hospitals I was working at, and as I left home, very, very ready to go to bed, as I had had a late night, I heard one of the patients just crying. And I've heard that before, but I don't know if it was because it was quiet or what it was, but it just really hit me, and hit me so hard. As I walked out the door, I said to myself, I can spare one more moment for this person. And so I turned around and I went back and I talked to her, and she was just sobbing and crying and saying things like, why did God create me like this? And she was somebody that suffered from psychosis, like schizophrenia. And I just remember feeling the humanness and the need and the lack of improvement. And as I left, there were many patients I heard. Then for some reason, I tuned into everyone, and I could hear a lot of them crying, and it just overwhelmed me. And at that point, I realized we just aren't doing enough. There's a lot of research coming out, but what's going to help me with the person right here in front of me? And so I felt, as a doctor, it was my responsibility to not just sit and wait for someone in an academic position to, come up with these answers and take 20 or 30 years. I needed to look for things the best I could now. So I began studying neuroscience, artificial intelligence, brain imaging, virtual reality, and other technology. And that's kind of what brought me here.
I think that the holistic approach and not relying purely on pharmaceuticals to solve the problem is definitely something that intrigues me. And your story, actually, my biological mother is schizophrenic. And so, I have a close personal, tie to how we can improve mental health using some of these ways, because so many people out there are struggling. We're seeing kind of an uptick with psychosis, specifically with schizophrenia, whether it's drug induced or whatnot. But there's not enough being done as far as alternative approaches, in my opinion, to help these people. And what works for one person may not work for another. And I think that that is what intrigued me the most about our previous conversations that we've had, specifically with brain imaging. I'm hoping that you can go into some detail on what's potentially possible with personalizing a treatment approach based on real-time data that we're getting from brain imaging, based on visual as well as audio stimuli that we could incorporate inside of a VR environment. I think that there's a lot of potential there on what could be done, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
So psychiatry is a very interesting profession, and the reason for that is that it's the only medical specialty that we have that basically relies on very few diagnostic tests or imaging or anything like that to make an actual diagnosis, which then leads to finding the cause of the symptoms and then a subsequent treatment to address the cause. Most medical specialties do that, at least to a lot of the conditions that they treat. The psychiatrists, not so much. We rely on something called the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. There are many editions that have come out, and they've changed over time. But the interesting part is that the way that it was created is basically a group of men that got around on a table. I don't know if it was an actual table, but they got around and they talked about symptoms that they were seeing, and they decided to take votes on what would we call this disorder, and what would we call this one and this one. And so one thing to keep in mind is that the disorders that we have, that we hear a lot, like obsessive compulsive disorder, or even schizophrenia, and even autism, although those have strong underpinnings with biology, even those were decided based off of criteria that people just voted on. There's no lab tests, there's no gold standard that they can compare it to. They can't say, for example, Alzheimer's disease is one of the few things that we actually have a gold standard on. And when someone dies, we can take their brain and take a sample of it and verify, yes, they have Alzheimer's. There's almost nothing else like that in mental health. And so it's a little bit arbitrary. We've come up with constructs that don't fit people a lot of the times. You don't fit into a category. Most of the time you fit into several categories, and you get disagreement. When this manual was created, actually, and I'll end it here because I don't want to spend all the time on this, but when the DSM was created, they agreed, we're not going to make this what we call valid. We're not going to make sure that it correlates with treatment or biology or anything like that, or anything, even environment, but we are going to make sure we have agreement so we can communicate. So it's really more of a dictionary. And so that's something that catches people. The other couple things that I would just quickly point out, why we need change, and why what I'm going to tell you about in a second is so important, is that the way we measure, because mental things are not easy to measure, we can't just sort of like put it in a test tube and then measure, how much of it there is. We come up with all these different tests, and these tests are also imperfect. They're sometimes based on those very subjective categories, and also the tests there's no gold standard. For example, ADHD in the past is just a list of symptoms that we came up with arbitrarily. And we don't know if there's 20 things that cause ADHD or one. We just don't know. But we make all these tests that measure whatever we think it's supposed to be. And then sometimes when people don't fit, we tell them, and we see this in autism a lot, for example, especially high functioning. Well, you don't fit the criteria because you looked at someone in the eye. And that then we look at their family, and their whole family has autism all throughout it, and they have all these other traits. And that happens with a lot of our diagnoses. And then the biggest problem is that because we don't know the cause, we don't know how to treat it very well. And so we treat everybody currently like they're the same person. We'll interview you, we'll get your individual history and things like that. But we don't actually go take the effort to individualize the treatment specifically to you and say, hey, which drug is supposed to work better for you? Okay, you're depressed, but there's all these different kinds of antidepressants. Which one? No, we don't do that. We just usually pick our favorite, or we pick one that statistically has a little bit higher chance, which is not very high. In some studies, maybe 30%. Your first time, we guess, maybe 15% the second time, and it can get worse over time. But so you see, there's a lot of guessing because the foundation isn't good. The foundation is kind of shaky. So naturally, the way we measure and the way we treat isn't going to be perfect, and we do a lot of guessing. So does that make sense? So on that,
it does, yeah. So as far as personalizing treatment using some of these later technologies, what do you think the capabilities are as we move forward?
Yeah, that's a great question. So now, if we look at what's coming, there are some amazing things. I would say that they're on the horizon, and actually much of it's already here, and we just haven't used it. Imaging is one example. It's not the only thing. I think we're missing an entire mindset, and I'd be happy to talk about that in a bit, but there's a whole different way of looking at the brain. But let me talk about imaging, since you did mention that. Imaging is, in the past, it's been used to, we'd use MRI, which is more like a photograph, a photograph of your brain. And we had access to what we call functional imaging, which is just pretty simply, it's looking at how your brain functions. It looks at activity patterns. So like, is it high or low activity? And what does it look like, in the pattern? And so in the past, we've decided that stuff wasn't useful because it was so variable between people, almost like we're individuals. And so we're going to have a different pattern, each one of us. And that's true. However, something really remarkable happened. I want to say it was 20, 30 years ago. And interestingly, it did not come out of the US. Now I'm not a neuroscientist. I study a lot of neuroscience. So forgive me if I'm getting something wrong or missing something, but to my knowledge, the first study of its kind that looked at what we now call brain networks came from a researcher with the last name of, I think it's Yao, Y-E-O, and some other colleagues. And what he found is that when he studied the brain, all of those activity patterns, they weren't random. They would frequently show up with some differences from individual to individual, but the differences were, also very, the similarities were also remarkable. So we could, for example, he found that when a person is just resting, when they're not problem solving, when they're not, trying to concentrate, when they're just kind of letting their mind wander, there's a particular pattern that shows up, a default pattern. And that is so similar that we can identify it in every person. And there's minor differences, but we can always find it. And then he found also that other patterns exist depending on what we do with our brain and what we're doing. And then up to 17 now. And actually, truthfully, there's some researchers that said our brain can infinitely recruit different patterns depending on the task. So it's a very complicated organ, but also very organized. And the reason I say it's interesting it didn't come out of the US is that a lot of what's coming out now is very holistic, as you said. It's showing that the brain, it doesn't work like, well, we used to say that we only use 10% of our brains, for example. And the truth is we use 100% all the time. It's just how high or how low and what pattern is that brain, working in. And so it's like that. Everything is holistic and it's connected. And because of that, Westernized medicine has not really been looking for it, because we kind of look for more like a machine or a computer. If a part breaks, we just replace it. That's the part that does it. But in the brain, no one part does one thing. One part does many things, and many things contribute to one experience. Does that make sense? And so it's more of a holistic,
that does.
And therefore sort of, out of China and Japan, they actually have a philosophy that's in some ways, it was needed to add to ours in order for us to start to understand the brain. So to your question, what can we do with brain imaging? Well, now that we understand it, or we're starting to understand it, there's a lot still to learn.
Yeah, we have a long way to go.
But when we begin to understand, and as we begin to understand, and part of this can be helped, which we could discuss in a bit here, but artificial intelligence can help. But when we do develop an understanding of the brain, we now have a goal, a target. We have sort of a direction to go. So instead of just guessing medicines by treating you like you're just a statistic, you're not an individual. And also, instead of, and some of the researchers are still doing this, they're trying to get your brain to conform to the average brain, the correct brain, the healthy brain. But the thing is, there are many healthy brains. There are many healthy brain types. And we don't want to destroy your individuality. We want to keep that, but make you healthy, kind of the best version of yourself. And that's what this offers when you combine the holistic view that was, discovered with some of these brain networks, and also the sort of mechanistic view that we get from Westernized medicine. Those come together to give us the ability to kind of do a little of both, individualized medicine, but also very precise. And so this is broad. We could go into examples, but my point is that what we're talking about is when you walk into a psychiatrist office, instead of the person talking to you and then giving you a subjective diagnosis, and then you walking out and knowing that most likely you'll be trying medicines of various types and combinations for anywhere from 6 months, maybe years even, with sometimes making you better, sometimes worse.
Make it worse, yeah.
Sometimes just side effects and all sorts of trouble. Now we can say, you know what? We know what we're trying to do. So at least we're going to only pick medicines that affect the regions that we want to affect. Now it's about finding the treatments that fit what we're trying to do. So there's still that. We're still working on that part, but at least we have a target.
One thing I know I talked to you briefly before that I'm working on as far as a roadmap item with my company, Verenity, is the use of video AI and how that could potentially be incorporated into treatment. And I think that there's something really interesting there. Now, this is very, very early days and we're years away. I want to preface it with that. But video AI is, I would say, in the last 2 to 3 months now at a quality where it's becoming indistinguishable from reality. And while scary and enters matrix land, it also opens up a lot of possibilities for how it could be utilized, particularly in exposure therapy. I think that if we could have a controlled environment where you have a professional such as yourself and you're working with someone that has traumas and triggers that they're trying to work through, creating a controlled environment that's virtual that actually brings them toward whatever trigger it is an interesting concept. And that's one we're exploring. What are your thoughts on both video AI as well as incorporating like tones and frequencies and sound therapy as a combination with that?
I absolutely love the idea. You know, speaking of PTSD, I don't know if I told you already, but I'm from a military background. I was trained in the Army, I'm an Army psychiatrist. And so I spent a number of years treating soldiers who had both traumatic brain injury and PTSD. And sometimes it's hard to tell the difference actually between those. But one of the things I learned during that time was a therapy called prolonged exposure therapy. And that therapy, the job basically is, let me tell you that sort of the theory behind it is that when a traumatic experience happens, your body goes into survival mode. So for example, let's say you're in a war and you almost die, or maybe a friend almost dies, and you suddenly become very, very hyper vigilant because you know that your life is at risk and you could die at any point. So that's a good thing. It's a natural response of your body. You're hyper aware of everything, and the way that you're thinking about everything is a threat.
Yeah.
So your mind gets in this position. It's normal actually for soldiers to return from war and have even several months of that exact same type of feeling that doesn't go away at first. It takes them a while when they're in that setting to sort of come out of it. And then over time, some people never come out of it. It just seems to persist. And that's basically what we call PTSD. A person can't stop thinking about the trauma, or they ruminate on it, or they even sometimes have flashbacks, or if it gets really bad, what we call pseudo hallucinations, which is not quite the same as schizophrenia, but they see things like shadows in the corner of their eyes, and they turn and they're sure like it's an enemy soldier or something like that. That's very normal. What happens then over time is hopefully, if you treat them correctly, if they don't get better on their own, a lot of times they get medicine, and we found that medicines are not always especially helpful in PTSD, although they can be, but they're not extremely helpful in a lot of cases. Prolonged exposure, and I'm going to tie this into immunity here in a second, but prolonged exposure is the concept where you basically take a person who's gone through a trauma, and then they form this sort of cognitive framework, we call it, or it's a worldview, it's a paradigm, and everything's been altered because of it. And we take them back to that paradigm, to that framework, and it's like almost like we're sitting on their shoulder and we re-experience it, and we're trying to do it with them a little bit at a time as they can tolerate it, and we increase exposure a little bit over time, monitoring their stress levels, and then eventually we kind of sit there with as much as they can tolerate it until they get bored. They're just sitting there like, okay, I can see that thinking about this isn't doing anything to me, and I'm starting to get bored. And at that point, the therapist says, wonderful, let's increase the exposure now. And they do that until they're just able to talk about the whole thing, think about the whole thing and it's boring to them. It's become like anything else.
Mm-hmm.
What's amazing about what your company is doing is that with virtual reality, you can basically control everything. You can control their vision, you can control what they hear. They can have a sense of, a balance and everything in terms of walking around in an environment, whatever it is. There's so much potential, and they can be exposed fully and completely immersed, which is sort of the ultimate goal of treatment. And sometimes we can't get that because you just can't ever get back there. But also you could control, it's, eventually as we start developing these things, you'll start controlling the level of exposure as well. So, but you see, it offers everything, the option, everything in between. And so that's what I see is I think one of the most amazing benefits in terms of virtual reality and PTSD. There's other things too. I mean, there's a lot of other conditions that
and even just childhood trauma, although, I mean, that's a hard one to think about exposure therapy specifically, depending on what we're talking about here. But the fact that you can work through any particular trauma, it doesn't have to be a soldier that was in a war. It could be anything from people experience trauma from relationships, from work. I've been in toxic work environments that kind of left me with PTSD, and I have childhood trauma as well. So working through some of those triggers, I wish I'd had something like this that would have helped me. I found that sound therapy was very helpful for me. So I'm excited to kind of combine the visual. It's kind of like Calm on steroids, right? Like there's a lot of people that use the Calm app, and I think it's great. I think sound therapy is great, but adding that visual component just brings it to a whole nother level.
What you guys are doing just amazing, and where you're headed to, even more remarkable. I think it's wonderful. It's such a great. We have maps now of what activates and deactivates in the brain. It creates specific patterns for each sound. And for each kind of visual thing that we see. So if we're targeting something, you could literally, as we start to get better at this, you could literally pick, we want this area and this area to be low or high, whatever we're doing, and this sound and this visual helps that. I'm so enthusiastic about it. I've been approached by other companies in the past. Virtual reality to me is one of the most important pieces of this. Right now I do use some other things that utilize, for example, there's a technology out that's called photobiomodulation light therapy. It's a headset that you wear. It increases blood flow to certain brain areas. It will detoxify the brain. It gets it sort of rebuilding new connections and everything. It's wonderful. We've used it in dementia and head injury and other things, and it's still a lot to study, but I've seen good effects. So that's one thing I'm using. There's other modalities like ultrasound and other things too. But virtual reality to me is a great thing for a couple of reasons. One is with the headset I use, it's just near infrared light. That's it. That's all I got. With virtual reality, I can basically, if we know what we're doing, we can recreate anything. I mean, what's the brain pattern when you do yoga? What's the brain pattern when you're playing a game? And then which game is causing which pattern? We can literally recreate anything that we do and then help it boost our brain function. And so sight and sound each activate the brain in different ways. When you add them together, it's like a synergistic effect. You've got one pathway activated here, and if it crosses here, and that's the area we're targeting, we have a boosted, more powerful effect without side effects. That's the
one thing that it kind of reminds me of, but just from a visual standpoint, rather than audio, is I don't know if you've seen that movie Awakenings with Robert De Niro, and it was based on a true story. Okay. And he was working in a facility that had a bunch of people that were basically comatose. I mean, they weren't in comas, but they were non-responsive. They were awake, their eyes were open, but they had no movement. I can't recall what it was that they were stricken with or whatever, even if they figured it out. But you'll have to watch. It's an older movie. I think it came out in like the 80s, but I always loved it because it was based on a true story, and also how they were able to have a glimpse of success by introducing a particular drug and then playing music. And what had happened is that each person actually came to life and was back to their normal selves, walking around, talking, interacting with people. Like, you literally would never have known. Some of these people were like this for decades in this like state where they were non-responsive. And here's the interesting thing.
Was it called Locked-in syndrome by chance? Do you happen to know?
I don't recall what it was. I don't.
Go ahead.
Yeah, but what I found really just fascinating was that each person, it wasn't just the drug alone that brought them back to life. It was the combination of that with audio, like playing music, but not just any music. Each person, you had to find out what music worked for them. So one person, it was opera. The next person, it was country. The next person, it was rock and roll. Like, the fact that every person, you had to find there, like, it was just a fascinating thing, and just goes to show how much or how little we know about the brain, right? I think that same principle behind that can apply to visuals as well, where you can adjust the visuals because what works for one person may not work for another, and this gives us the ability to adjust it in real time to see what works. So
looking at it, and of course I haven't seen it, so I just looked it up, and it was saying they used L-DOPA, which is a Parkinson's.
Yeah, yep.
That's the drug.
That was it.
Okay.
That was the drug that they used. Yep.
And then they use, so basically that's pure dopamine. And so, isn't that amazing? So dopamine is amazing because, I don't want to get off on a tangent. See, neuroscience is I'm a geek, and so I love that. But dopamine is a molecule that we really misunderstand a lot, and it's one of those molecules that we always associate with a rush or a high. But truthfully, its job is to get us motivated, and sometimes that means even negative motivation. But the thing in this movie that's amazing to me is that it's also the thing that gets you up and moving. It affects you physically and mentally. If you don't have enough, you can't move, literally, not just mentally, physically. And so that's a very interesting example that you gave. I love it because some of the technology I've also seen a company called Mendy, which is a little headset kind of thing that you wear. You put it over your forehead, and then you concentrate and you look at an app while you're doing some things, and you're trying to do certain things with your mind, and as you do, it moves this ball on the screen. And one of the things they think is that it works by teaching you to increase the dopamine in your frontal lobe to help with attention and things like that. So it's a great example.
You'll have to watch it if you haven't already. It's a great movie. I mean, who doesn't love Robert De Niro? I mean, pretty much any movie he's ever been in is good. So
taking all of that and knowing which thing to use, what's going to help what condition, and things like that. So I guess I'm less focused right now on, I spent the last few years trying to develop the science, actually longer than that, and the approach that I'm using, and combined with traditional psychiatric concepts, that then in terms of what I'm doing now, it's more, how do I get this word out? I also want all this technology. I want all of this stuff to be offered, and my use of artificial intelligence, it never decides what a treatment is. Probably because I can't verify it. It goes through too much. So ultimately, at the end of the day, the doctor has to look and say, does this make sense? It's just a tool to give additional knowledge. So that's kind of how I use it. But I'm excited for the role of AI, for the role of virtual reality. I'm excited to see where you guys go, and hopefully we can meet up and kind of do, as the name of my company is Synergic Mind. Hopefully we can synergize some of the things that we're doing going forward.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me today. I think it's been a fascinating conversation where we have a lot to learn and grow and evolve as we move forward with technology, and how this can affect our lives, hopefully in a positive way, or try to steer it in that direction at least. And I look forward to working with you in the future.
Thank you as well. It's great to see you.